Your soulmate wrote a secret love letter. You must read it before tomorrow. Something was left behind in a place nobody was supposed to look, and by the time your soulmate realized what they had written, the words were already carrying everything they had been too afraid to say out loud. It was late. The room was quiet. A single light was glowing beside them as they stared at a blank page, their hands completely still. Then they wrote your name. Not casually. Not as a memory. They wrote it like someone finally admitting the truth to themselves. And what came next was a letter they never expected you to see. But there's something unusual about this letter. It wasn't written for someday. It was written because tomorrow suddenly felt important. One sentence in particular made them stop, put the pen down, and stare at the words for several long seconds. What could possibly have happened to make them feel that way? Stay with this, because that sentence is where the entire story begins to change. Imagine the scene for a moment. Outside, the world is moving normally. Cars pass. Phones light up. People laugh somewhere in the distance. But inside that quiet room, your soulmate is having a conversation with you without you even being there. They remember the little things, the moments you probably thought they had forgotten. A look you gave them. A conversation that ended too soon. Something you said that stayed in their mind long after the moment was over. They remember the times they wanted to reach out and didn't. They remember opening their phone, typing a message, staring at it, and deleting it before sending. But tonight, instead of deleting their feelings, they put them on paper. And slowly, the letter becomes more honest. They admit that something about you has never felt temporary. They admit that even when they tried to move forward, a part of them kept returning to the same question: what if the person they've been waiting for was right in front of them all along? Then they write a line that reveals why they believe you need to read this before tomorrow. The strangest part isn't what they wrote first. It's what they crossed out. There were several sentences hidden beneath the ink, words they couldn't bring themselves to leave exposed. But one thought survived every revision: should have told you sooner. Those words remained. They stared at them, took a slow breath, and continued writing. They explained that there was a reason for their silence, and it wasn't because they didn't care. In fact, their silence came from caring more than they knew how to handle. They were afraid that saying everything would change the connection between you. Afraid that once the truth was spoken, there would be no way to return to the comfortable uncertainty you both understood. But then something happened that made them reconsider waiting. A small moment. A realization. A sudden understanding that time doesn't always give people another chance to say what matters. And that's when the letter stopped being a collection of memories and became something much more personal, a confession meant specifically for you. Yet the most important sentence hasn't been revealed. And when you hear what they wrote next, you'll understand why tomorrow matters so much. Something happened just after they finished that sentence that made them close the letter instead of continuing. Their fingers rested on the folded page while they sat completely still, almost as if they were trying to decide whether they were brave enough to let you know the truth. Then their phone lit up. Your name wasn't on the screen, but somehow the notification made them think of you immediately. They looked at the unfinished letter again, and this time there was no hesitation. They picked up the pen and added another paragraph. They wrote about the distance between you, not just the physical distance, but the invisible space created by unanswered questions and moments neither of you had fully explained. They admitted that they had replayed certain conversations in their mind more times than they would ever confess. And then they revealed something surprisingly simple: they weren't asking you to become someone different. They weren't asking you to prove anything. They just wanted one honest chance to tell you what their heart had been carrying quietly. Then came the part they almost couldn't write. They described the moment they realized that missing you wasn't just about wanting your presence. It was about wanting to share ordinary life with you. They imagined hearing your voice during an ordinary morning, laughing over something that nobody else would understand, sitting beside you without needing to fill every silence. The fantasy wasn't dramatic. That was what made it powerful. They weren't imagining some perfect movie scene. They were imagining you being part of the little moments that usually go unnoticed. And suddenly, the letter revealed a deeper truth. Somewhere along the way, you had stopped being simply someone they cared about and become someone they naturally pictured in their future. They wrote that they didn't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was one conversation. Maybe it was 100 tiny moments. But they knew something had changed. And if you're wondering why they never said this before, there's a detail coming next that explains far more than you might expect. Before we continue, if this message is connecting with something you've been feeling lately, you can quietly share what this story reminds you of in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories like this, subscribing means you'll be here when the next one unfolds. Now, back to the letter. Near the bottom of the page, your soulmate wrote something that completely changed the tone of everything before it. They admitted they had been waiting for a sign, not some impossible miracle, but a moment when speaking honestly would feel right. Then they realized they had been waiting for certainty when what they really needed was courage. They looked at the clock. Tomorrow was getting closer. The thought of waiting another day suddenly felt heavier than the fear of telling you everything. So they folded the letter carefully and placed it somewhere only they would think to look. But they didn't seal it. They left the envelope open. Because there was still one final decision to make, whether you were meant to receive the letter directly from them, or whether something unexpected would bring its message to you another way. Something about the unfinished letter began bothering them so deeply that they couldn't leave it alone. Long after midnight, they returned to the table and opened the envelope again. The room was almost completely silent now, except for the faint sound of the clock moving forward. They read every line from the beginning, slowly, as though they were hearing their own feelings for the first time. Then they reached the final paragraph. Their expression changed. Not because they regretted writing it, but because they suddenly understood what the letter had actually become. It wasn't simply a confession. It was an explanation for every moment when their actions seemed confusing, every pause that looked like indifference, and every time they appeared close to saying something before pulling back. They added one more sentence beneath everything else: "If you ever wondered whether you mattered to me, I hope this finally answers you." Then they stopped. The pen remained in their hand, but there were no more words. What they didn't realize was that the letter had already exposed something they had spent months trying to hide, even from themselves. They had been protecting their heart by pretending they could wait. Wait for the perfect moment. Wait until circumstances were easier. Wait until they knew exactly what you wanted. But while they were waiting, their feelings kept becoming clearer. They remembered a moment when you had shown them kindness without expecting anything in return. They remembered the way you listened when they needed someone. They remembered how strangely familiar your presence felt, even during periods when you weren't speaking. Those memories weren't dramatic, but together they formed a pattern they could no longer ignore. And now the letter contained the truth behind that pattern. They weren't afraid of loving you. They were afraid of discovering that you might not feel the same way. That fear had kept the letter hidden. But tomorrow was forcing a choice. Keep protecting the secret, or finally allow you to see it. Then, just before closing the envelope, they noticed something they hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the page was a small blank space. They could have left it empty. Instead, they wrote a question. Just one. It wasn't a demand, and it wasn't a promise. It was the kind of question someone asks when they finally stop pretending they don't care about the answer. They wrote, "If I told you everything, would you still choose to stay?" They stared at it for a long time. Then they folded the letter, placed it inside the envelope, and wrote your name across the front. For the first time, the secret had a destination. But there was still one problem: they had no idea how to give it to you. Morning was approaching, and with every passing minute, the opportunity seemed to become more real. Somewhere between fear and hope, they made a decision that would bring the letter closer to you than either of you expected. And what happened next would make the words, "before tomorrow," mean something completely different. Something shifted in the quiet hours before morning, when they finally stopped asking themselves whether they should send the letter and started wondering what might happen if they didn't. The envelope sat on the edge of the table, your name visible beneath the soft light. They picked it up, walked toward the door, then stopped. For a few seconds, they simply stood there holding it. Every excuse they'd used to delay this moment suddenly sounded small. They remembered the conversations that never reached their real ending. The almost confessions. The moments when one of you seemed ready to say something, only for the timing to disappear. And now there was no perfect sentence left to wait for. There was only a choice. So they slipped the envelope into their bag and stepped outside. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. And with every step, the distance between the secret and the truth became smaller. But there was another reason they were determined to get this letter to you before tomorrow. Earlier that day, something had happened that reminded them how quickly ordinary moments can become important memories. It wasn't dramatic. No announcement. No grand scene. Just a simple conversation with someone they trusted. That person had asked them a question about you, and for the first time, your soulmate didn't change the subject. They didn't laugh it off. They didn't pretend everything was complicated. They simply smiled and admitted, "I still care." Those two words opened a door they had kept locked for far too long. Suddenly, they understood that hiding their feelings wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was only keeping two people from knowing where they truly stood. And that realization followed them all the way to the place where they intended to leave the letter. If this story is reminding you of someone, feel free to share that feeling in the comments. Sometimes putting a thought into words helps us understand what we've been carrying quietly. And if you enjoy stories that unfold one hidden truth at a time, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with us for the next one. Now imagine what happened when they finally reached the destination. They took the envelope out and looked at your name again. Their heartbeats seemed louder than the city around them. For one moment, they nearly turned around. Then they noticed something that made them stop completely. There, in front of them, was a familiar place connected to one of your earliest meaningful memories together. It felt almost symbolic. Not because everything was predetermined, but because suddenly the past and present were standing in the same place. They held the letter tightly, took one final breath, and made their decision. But instead of handing it over immediately, they placed the envelope somewhere you would naturally find it. And when you eventually discovered your name written across that envelope, you wouldn't just be reading a love letter. You'd be discovering the truth behind everything that had been left unsaid. Something about the envelope made you pause before you even touched it. It was sitting exactly where you wouldn't normally expect to find anything personal, almost hidden in plain sight. Your name was written across the front in handwriting you recognized instantly. For a moment, you simply stared at it. You didn't open it. You didn't move. You just felt that strange sensation that arrives when something ordinary suddenly becomes important. There was no long explanation. No message on your phone. Just your name, written carefully on a sealed envelope. And then you noticed one more detail. The date had been written in the corner. Tomorrow's date. Your curiosity sharpened immediately. Why would someone leave a letter for you with that date marked so deliberately? You picked it up, feeling the slight weight of the pages inside, and realized this wasn't something written in a few careless minutes. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had been thinking about you long before you knew the letter existed. You opened it slowly. The first paragraph wasn't what you expected. There was no dramatic declaration. Instead, your soulmate began by admitting that they didn't know how to say what they needed to say face to face. They wrote about the moments when they had almost told you the truth, then stopped because they were afraid the words might change everything. They confessed that sometimes they acted calm when they were anything but calm. Sometimes they seemed distant because they were trying to understand feelings that had become too complicated to hide. Then came a sentence that made you read the previous paragraph again. They wrote that every time they imagined a future without you in it, something felt strangely incomplete. Not because they couldn't live without you, but because somewhere along the way, their idea of happiness had quietly begun including you. That wasn't something they had planned. It simply happened. And the next page explained exactly when they first realized it. You turned the page, and suddenly the story became more specific. They described a moment you may have considered completely ordinary. You had probably forgotten the details, but they hadn't. They remembered where you were standing, what the atmosphere felt like, and the expression on your face when you said something that stayed with them. They wrote that they went home afterward and kept thinking about it. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what those words revealed about your heart. That was the moment they stopped seeing your connection as something temporary. Then, near the bottom of the page, you found the sentence they had rewritten several times before finally leaving it there: I don't need you to answer everything today. I just need you to know that my feelings were real. You lowered the letter for a moment, letting those words settle. But the page wasn't finished. There was another paragraph underneath, and the first sentence began with a confession that explained why they had been so determined for you to read this before tomorrow. Something about the next paragraph made you stop breathing for a second. Not because it was shocking, but because it answered a question you had never known how to ask. Your soulmate wrote that there had been a particular night when they nearly called you. They had your name on the screen, their thumb hovering over the button, while their mind replayed every reason they should stay silent. Then they admitted what finally stopped them. They were afraid that if they heard your voice, all the carefully controlled feelings would come rushing back at once. So they put the phone down. They told themselves they could wait. They told themselves tomorrow would be easier. But tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow, until they realized they had spent too much time postponing something that mattered. That was why the letter existed. Not because they suddenly discovered their feelings, but because they finally became tired of hiding them. You continued reading, and the tone became softer. They weren't asking you to forget the past or pretend everything had always been perfect. Instead, they acknowledged the moments when they may have confused you. The unanswered messages. The sudden pauses. The times when they seemed interested and then pulled away. They explained that some of those moments came from uncertainty, but others came from something much more vulnerable. They didn't know whether they were allowed to hope for you. They had watched you from a distance, trying to understand whether your kindness meant something deeper or whether they were simply imagining a connection that wasn't there. Then came the sentence that made everything suddenly feel different. They wrote, "Maybe you were waiting for me to say it, while I was waiting for you to somehow know." You read it twice. Because suddenly, the silence between you didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like two people had been standing on opposite sides of the same door, both wondering who would turn the handle first. And then you reached the final page. There were fewer words there, but every sentence carried more weight. Your soulmate wrote that they didn't want this letter to pressure you into giving an answer. They wanted it to give you freedom, the freedom to finally know what had been hidden behind their silence. They wrote about choosing honesty over pride, clarity over guessing, and a real conversation over another season of unanswered questions. Then they revealed why they had marked tomorrow so carefully. Tomorrow wasn't about some impossible deadline. It was about a moment they had decided they could no longer postpone. They planned to speak to you. The letter was only the beginning. At the very bottom of the page, beneath everything else, they had written one final line. You read it once. Then again. And suddenly, the entire letter seemed to point toward one moment that hadn't happened yet. Because tomorrow, they weren't planning to send another message. They were planning to look you in the eyes and finally tell you what the letter could only begin to explain. Something about that final sentence stayed with you long after you lowered the letter. You looked at the clock, then back at the page, wondering how someone could have carried so much emotion without ever saying it directly. But there was another detail you hadn't noticed at first. Beneath the final line, almost hidden against the fold of the paper, was a tiny handwritten note. It wasn't part of the original letter. It looked like it had been added at the very last moment. You unfolded the page completely and read it. Your soulmate had written that there was one memory they hoped you still remembered, the moment when the two of you laughed together for no important reason at all. They said that was when they realized they didn't simply enjoy being around you. They felt at home in your presence. And suddenly, all those small memories you dismissed began appearing differently. The quiet conversations. The unexpected smiles. The moments that seemed insignificant at the time. They had been collecting meaning in someone else's heart. Then your phone vibrated. You looked at the screen, and there it was, a message from your soulmate.